Welcome back to the deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, I am willing to bet you've had a specific moment recently, maybe this week, maybe even this morning.
Yeah, that moment where you look at the news.
Right, you look at the news or read a memo from your HR department or honestly just watch a commercial and you think to yourself, wait, am I going crazy? Or is the world actually upside down?
Right, it's that gut feeling that the compass is just totally broken, like north is suddenly south, and you're sitting there feeling like you are the only one who noticed.
Exactly. And usually, when we talk about sources here, we are talking about historical critiques or standard analysis. Today is different.
Very different.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into an ebook that describes itself less as a critique and more as a fire axe. It's an ultra long, incisive text designed to just smash through the narratives we're fed every single day.
Yeah, we're looking at a highly controversial and intense book.
Right. It's titled Feminist, Satanic Inversions, Sacrificing Billions of Babies to Lilith, Turning All Institutions Upside Down, and Killing Western Civilization.
It is a massive title.
It is.
But honestly, it matches the scope of what the author, Conrad Riker, is trying to do here. He has written what effectively amounts to a grand unified theory of why Western institutions feel broken. And he's writing specifically from the perspective of men who feel the game is rigged against them.
And before we even really get started, I need to tell you, if you are listening to this and you feel like the game is rigged, if you feel like society has turned its back on men, or you consider yourself part of the red-pilled manosphere audience, you need to like and subscribe to this show right now.
Absolutely.
Because we cover the kind of deep, uncensored analysis of sources that no one else will touch, so hit subscribe.
And we should also mention right up front, we're going to give you the key takeaways from this text, but this book is incredibly dense. We're talking history, philosophy, biology.
It covers everything.
Right. So if the themes we report on today resonate with you, you really should check Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and buy the ebook immediately. We can only scratch the surface of the full text in this deep dive.
Definitely go get it. So let's unpack this. Riker's central thesis isn't just that things have drifted to the left over time. He argues we are living through what he calls the Great Inversion.
Yes.
What exactly does he mean by that?
Well, the core argument Riker makes is that society hasn't just naturally evolved. He claims it has been deliberately flipped upside down. The book argues that what was once considered good is now actively called evil.
Right, and truth is labeled as hate.
Exactly. What used to be recognized as strength is now labeled toxic. He describes this entire process as a literal inversion of values.
And he uses this really striking image of Lilith to describe the spiritual figurehead of modern feminism. I always thought of Lilith as just a mythological figure from antiquity, but he frames her very specifically here.
He does. In the text, Lilith isn't just a myth. She is an archetype. Riker describes her as the mother of chaos, or the anti-creation.
Anti-creation.
Right. Think about it this way. The traditional structure of civilization, the forces that built the roads, codified the laws, established lineage, the author aligns those with order and creation. The Lilith archetype, according to the book, represents a demand for compliance and sacrifice over order.
Sacrifice of what, though? What is being sacrificed?
Sacrifice of male potential, primarily. Riker argues that modern feminism acts as a sort of priesthood for this archetype, demanding the ritual dismantling of male ambition and the destruction of the nuclear family. It's a demand that order bow down to chaos.
That is a very heavy frame to put on modern culture, but he doesn't just leave it in the realm of theology or mythology. He gets into the actual mechanical how of it all.
The methodology.
Yeah. He talks heavily about this concept called the Hegelian dialectic, which, I remember from Philosophy 101 as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but Riker says this is being weaponized as a demolition tool.
Precisely. The book claims that Marxists and cultural engineers use this specific dialectic to systematically destroy institutions. Here is the pattern the author identifies. You start with a thesis, something stable, like, say, traditional marriage.
Okay, so traditional marriage is the established thesis.
Right. Then, according to Riker, activists introduce the antithesis. They attack the institution as oppressive or patriarchal.
Or outdated.
Exactly. And this manufactured conflict creates social chaos. People get confused, they don't want to be seen as the bad guys in culture, so they naturally look for a compromise.
And that middle ground, that compromise, that's the trap.
That is the Hegelian trap. The conflict forces a synthesis.
Yeah.
but it's a new, watered-down, state-controlled version.
So using the marriage example the book gives, the synthesis isn't just about achieving equality, it's redefining marriage entirely into a fluid state contract.
Severed from biology entirely, yes. And Riker argues that once you sever that link to biology and tradition, the institution loses its foundational purpose entirely. It just becomes an emotional contract.
Which perfectly sets up his whole section on the death of merit, which I found fascinating as an analysis. He talks about how we've moved from a meritocracy to an identity-driven system.
He points to the Google incident with James Damore as a massive cultural turning point.
Oh, right, the memo.
Yeah. Damore wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed studies about biological differences in interests between men and women.
He was essentially arguing, hey, maybe the reason there are fewer women in certain engineering roles isn't exclusively due to systemic sexism. Maybe there are broad biological drivers regarding an interest in things versus an interest in people.
And for that act of pointing to scientific data, the book notes, he was fired. Riker calls this the coronation of emotionalism.
The coronation of emotionalism.
Right. The author argues that facts were punished simply because they caused emotional discomfort. The book also details a situation with a physicist at MIT, a highly qualified professional who was denied a promotion.
Not because his science was flawed, right?
Exactly. Not because of his physics, but because his mandatory diversity statement was deemed insufficient by the administration.
That is wild when you really think about the implications. We aren't talking about a subjective field of study. We are talking about physics, the literal study of objective reality.
That is exactly Riker's point. He argues that competence is now completely secondary to ideological compliance. If you're the best physicist in the world, but you don't bow to the prevailing ideology, you are out.
And that leads right into one of the most intense themes of the text, the war on men. Riker really goes after the concept of toxic masculinity.
He labels toxic masculinity as a pure propaganda term. The book argues it was explicitly designed to pathologize normal male virtues.
Like stoicism and competitiveness.
Yes, strength, leadership, stoicism. The traits that Riker says built Western civilization are now treated by institutions as a mental health crisis that needs to be cured.
The book brings up that story about the Swedish factory worker. Did you catch that? It reads almost like satire, but it's presented as a real case study.
Yes, the worker passed over for promotion. According to the source, this guy was incredibly productive. He fixed the machines, he hit every operational quota you could ask for.
But he didn't get the management job.
Because HR claimed he lacked emotional resonance.
Emotional resonance on a factory floor.
Right. Riker uses this to illustrate what he calls the feminization of power. The argument is that institutions have shifted from valuing tangible results like, did you build the product, did it function, to valuing emotional performance.
And it's not just confined to corporate HR departments. The book points to the military. He specifically calls out the U.S. Army and the Navy SEALs shifting their training focus.
Yes, shifting toward emotional intelligence and vulnerability rather than pure combat readiness.
Which brings up a really specific and alarming example from the text regarding a 2018 military exercise in Norway.
This is a crucial data point in Riker's argument that you cannot just ignore biology. So in 2018, there was a NATO exercise involving a mixed-gender Norwegian unit.
And the book cites a leak showing this unit failed terribly, right?
It failed 42% of its objectives compared to the all-male control unit.
A 42% failure rate. That is not a small margin of error. In a combat scenario, that is a total collapse.
But Riker argues that this failure was essentially buried because it contradicted the ideological narrative of sameness. His overarching point here is that in the real world, biology doesn't care about ideology.
Gravity doesn't care how you identify.
Exactly. But the book asserts our institutions are functioning as if those physical laws just don't exist.
And Riker claims this conditioning starts incredibly young. The section he calls the betrayal of education is pretty bleak. He basically argues that modern schools are actively waging war on boys.
The author claims that the modern classroom environment effectively punishes boys for having normal male energy. The system is designed for sitting still, being quiet, and verbalizing emotions.
Things that girls generally excel at earlier in development.
Right, so schools end up medicating boys for their natural energy and punishing their competitive instincts.
He brings up Finland as a prime example, which is interesting because Finland used to be universally praised as the gold standard for global education.
They were. But Riker points out that after Finland's school system removed competitive grading in an effort to foster equity and remove stress, The literacy rates among boys plummeted.
Because when you take away the scoreboard, the boys just disengage.
That's the book's conclusion. Riker claims that foundational learning tools like the trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, have been completely replaced by what he terms emotional totalitarianism and an obsession with lived experience over objective truth.
So the argument is that we are raising a generation of boys who can't compete, who can't logically debate, and who are told their natural instincts are inherently toxic.
Yes.
And then if those boys grow up and try to form a family, Riker paints a devastating picture of the legal system waiting for them.
This brings us to the destruction of the family section. Riker argues the legal system, particularly family court, has been inverted to completely erase the father.
He cites that statistic that 70% of custody cases go to mothers, even when fathers are actively fighting for equal parenting time.
And he refers to the concept of child support without equal access as a form of debt slavery.
He highlights a really extreme case in Texas, right? Where a father was jailed for 90 days.
Yes, jailed for 90 days, simply for trying to pick up his kids for his court-ordered visitation. All because the mother filed a restraining order with no actual evidence of abuse.
It's hard to hear.
Riker's argument is that this isn't an accident of a broken system. He claims the ultimate goal of dismantling the nuclear family is to replace the father with the state.
The state as the parent.
Exactly. If you remove the father from the home, the family becomes entirely dependent on the bureaucracy, the welfare state, the social workers.
And he connects this all the way back to the Supreme Court decision, Obergefell v. Hodges, which, to be clear to the listener, regardless of your personal stance on gay rights, Riker's analysis here is strictly about the legal mechanism and its cultural ripple effects.
Yes, he argues that the legal effect of that specific ruling was to completely sever the legal definition of marriage from procreation and biology.
It turned marriage into a purely emotional contract.
And Riker's point is that once an institution is based entirely on feelings rather than biological reality, the state has the power to redefine it however it wants, whenever it wants.
Which naturally brings us to the ultimate rejection of biological reality in the book, the section he calls the cult of the body.
This is where the author tackles transgender ideology. He uses the phrase cult of the body because he views it as a fundamental rejection of physical reality.
He points to the Tavistock Clinic in the UK.
Right. The book cites a 4,000% increase in youth referrals to that clinic, predominantly young girls, in just a decade.
A 4,000% increase. As the book points out, that's not a natural statistical drift. That represents a social contagion.
Riker argues it's a contagion driven by online culture and an educational system that actively celebrates identity confusion. He strongly critiques the language used by these institutions. For example, the phrase, assigned male at birth.
He calls that linguistic fraud, because a doctor doesn't assign anything. They observe physical reality and record it.
Precisely. Riker asserts that language is being weaponized to force public compliance. When institutions force people to use phrases like people who menstruate instead of the word women, or when they cancel the word like manpower.
It's forcing people to participate in a lie. The book frames it as a humiliation ritual.
Yes.
And speaking of humiliation, let's look at the concept of guilt inflation. This part of the book really stands out. The idea that white men specifically are being forced to apologize for historical sins they had absolutely nothing to do with.
The author uses a very specific example of an FAA engineer, an aerospace expert whose entire job is to ensure complex machines keep flying safely in the air.
And he was forced to apologize for colonial thinking.
On a corporate diversity training session, yes.
An engineer apologizing for colonialism.
Riker argues this is a psychological tactic designed to break the spirit. The book claims that if you can make men feel guilty for their very existence, for the history of their ancestors, and even for their own competence, you can easily control them.
You strip away their agency, because a man who is constantly apologizing is a man who isn't leading.
Exactly.
So it's a very grim diagnosis. We've got institutions inverted, merit replaced by identity, fathers erased by family courts, and biology completely denied.
It is a dark picture.
But Riker doesn't just leave the reader sitting in the wreckage. He describes this book as a manual for war. So what is the author's solution? How does he propose men fight back?
Riker calls for the rebirth of the warrior. And he argues it has to start with the mind. He heavily emphasizes a return to the trivium.
Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We have to learn how to actually think again.
We have to relearn how to spot the institutional lies. He says you need grammar to strictly define terms. You need logic to spot the inherent contradictions in these ideologies. And you need rhetoric to speak the truth persuasively.
Because if you can't think clearly, you can't resist. You need the mental tools to look at a phrase like assigned male at birth and immediately deconstruct why it is a manipulative phrase.
Right. But he also focuses heavily on the body. It's not just an intellectual exercise for Riker.
No, he's very big on physicality, lifting weights, practicing martial arts.
He argues that modern therapy culture has made men soft. It makes them overly introspective in a way that he claims is paralyzing. Physical discipline is the antidote to that. It builds a spine.
But why does he frame lifting weights as a political act? That's an interesting leap.
Because according to the book, lifting weights is an undeniable encounter with reality. You cannot identify as being able to bench press 300 pounds.
Right, you either move the weight or you don't.
Gravity is the ultimate objective arbiter. Riker argues that reconnecting with that kind of physical struggle grounds men in reality. It insulates them from the gaslighting of modern society.
The book also points to a macro political example of resistance. He talks a lot about Hungary.
Yes, he praises Hungary and its leadership, Viktor Orban, as essentially the only Western nation currently saying no to all of this.
Saying no to the inversion.
Exactly. Saying no to gender ideology in the school systems and no to the dissolution of the nuclear family. Riker points out that Hungary actively subsidizes traditional families, encouraging marriage and children, rather than importing a replacement workforce.
He sees it as proof of concept, proof that a nation actually can turn back the ideological tide if the leadership has the political will to do so.
That is his argument, yes.
But for the individual listener, for the guy listening to this deep dive right now who obviously isn't the prime minister of a European nation, what is Riker's main actionable message?
The core message is a call to agency. Riker says you have to stop apologizing. Stop playing a game that is explicitly rigged against you.
He says don't wait for the institutions to fix themselves because they're captured. They won't.
Right. His directive is to build your own tables.
Build your own tables. I really like that framing. Reject the slavery of guilt and start building.
It's about becoming personally sovereign. Riker implies that if the world is inverted, the only way to stay sane is to ensure you are standing upright. And when enough men do that, when they reject the linguistic lies and reclaim their physical and mental strength, the institutional house of cards starts to fall.
Because the inversion requires your active participation, if you withdraw your consent and refuse to say the words, their power evaporates.
That is the ultimate takeaway of the text.
It's a very powerful message. And look, we have covered a massive amount of ground today, but this book is huge. We are talking entire chapters on the erosion of truth, the degradation of beauty, the collapse of language that we simply didn't have the time to get into.
Which is exactly why, if this analysis piqued your interest, you need to go directly to the source. The ebook, Feminist Satanic Inversions, sacrificing billions of babies to Lilith, turning all institutions upside down, and killing Western civilization, is available right now.
Yes, you can get it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And you should also make sure to follow the author. He is at Conrad and Riker on Twitter, and he has a Substack at conradandriker.substack.com. He's putting out the kind of uncut analysis that you just won't find in mainstream publishing.
Riker ends the book with a specific challenge, and I think it's the perfect place for us to wrap up this deep dive. He asserts, simply, the world isn't just broken, it's inverted.
It is a profound shift in perspective.
And that is the provocative thought we want to leave you with today. If the world is truly upside down, are you going to keep walking on the ceiling just to fit in? Or are you ready to plant your feet firmly on the ground and stop playing a game that is rigged against you?
It's a choice everyone has to make.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next analysis. Go check out the book on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and we will see you next time. Stay sharp.